Lecture 19, Sartre on Emotions and Responsibility.
The idea that emotions are choices informs one of Sartre's first philosophical publications. In the late 30s, more than 5 years before he would publish Being and Nothingness, he writes actually a huge manuscript. In fact, I don't think Sartre writes any small manuscripts. Sartre wrote a huge manuscript which was to be called The Psyche. But of that work, we only have one piece of it, the piece he published in 1938, which is called The Emotions, the Sketch of a Theory. It's a fascinating essay, and one can see in it all sorts of theses which will emerge full-blown 5 or so years later. The central thesis, though, is that emotions are choices, and emotions involve alternatives, options, and most importantly, perhaps, involve a kind of purposiveness which most scholars and psychologists have simply ignored. The key phrase of that early work is a very dramatic phrase. Sartre says that emotions are magical transformations of the world. And what I'd like to do in this lecture is try to understand what that means and to see how it fits into his overall philosophy. What he wants to do with this thesis is, first of all, to get away from a mechanistic picture of emotions as physiological disturbances. The idea that emotions are bodily upsets, which we then experience. Instead, predictably, he wants to show that emotions are choices, and in particular they are strategies for coping with difficulties, and they are therefore our responsibility and not the source of excuses. His first target is the great American psychologist, philosopher, William James. James's views on emotions, in fact, are quite complex, and they are often oversimplified. His religious writings, for example, the essay Will to Believe, involves a really subtle notion about the ways in which we can choose our emotions, choose our attitudes towards the world, something that in fact would be very much in line with what Sartre is arguing. But the target that Sartre focuses on is a very famous essay that James wrote in the late 19th century called What is an Emotion?, which he then reworks later for a book and finds its way into his Principles of Psychology as well. In that work, James has one formulation which psychologists ever since have used as the basis of a great deal of their research. And it simply goes like this. An emotion is an upsetting perception which causes in us a physiological disturbance. James at one point says a visceral disturbance, and we are quite aware of what that means. The idea of our stomach tightening up, the idea of feeling flushed, the idea of feeling sometimes cold, but the various kinds of very easily specifiable physical operations of the body, which then give rise to or cause a set of distinctive sensations. The feeling of a visceral upset, the feeling of a chill, the feeling of being flushed. In short, what James argues is that this perception of the physiological upset is, and he both italicizes and capitalizes the word is the emotion. In other words, an emotion is a set of sensations which are caused by a distinctive set of physiological responses, which in turn are caused by some upsetting perception. Nietzsche once says, it is not the least charm of a theory that it's easily refutable. And the truth is that the beauty of James's theory has often been the idea that he is so specific that it is very easy for a theorist to come around and say, the theory is right, the theory is wrong, here's the evidence, and here's the counter-evidence. It doesn't involve such vague terms as affect that philosophers can argue about for ages without ever pinning it down. Anyway, in James's own time, he was challenged, for example, by some fellow physiologists who claimed that the number of physiological phenomena that gave rise to sensations just wasn't expansive and broad enough to account for the huge number of emotions that we experience. On the other side, it was argued that, in fact, although it's true that emotions are sensations with a physical origin, They must be something else besides. And it's this argument, this side of the argument, that Sartre wants to weigh in on. Because Sartre wants to say is that James ignores at least two very important features of emotion. First of all, he will argue that emotions, like all mental phenomena, and here we see Sartre's debt to Husserl, emotions are necessarily intentional. They have intentionality. That means that they are not simply feelings or sensations, but they refer outside of themselves to the world. Or to put it rather simply, emotions are always about something. You don't just love, you love someone or something. You don't just hate, you hate someone or something. You can't just be angry. You've got to be angry at someone, about something. You can't just be sad. You have to be sad about something. And even those cases with what we might call mysterious objects. For example, in dread, what we are worried about is perhaps the unknown. Or there is what Freud later calls free-floating anxiety, the idea of being extremely disturbed and upset about something one knows not what. There is, of course, the question of mood. When sadness, for example, expands beyond being sad about this particular thing, but I think it's not a stretch of our language or our conception of mood to say that when one is sad or depressed or joyful, one is nevertheless sad or depressed or joyful about something, perhaps just the state of the world as a whole or one's own position in it. In short, all emotions are intentional in the sense that they are always about something. And what this means is they can't be mere sensations or feelings because feelings aren't about anything. Or perhaps one can say, feeling is a very vague general notion which encompasses within it both feelings which are intentional, namely emotions, and perhaps those feelings, merely sensations, which are not. But a headache is not about anything. It might be caused by something, for example, your mother-in-law coming to visit. But we don't say that the headache is about your mother-in-law. And similarly, if you have a pain in your toe, it might be because you stepped on a nail. But nevertheless, the pain is not about the nail. But if you're caused to be angry by somebody insulting you, it is not just the cause, it is also the intentional object of the emotion. So you're angry about the offense. You're angry at the person. This is what James leaves out. And of course, one can try and save James by saying, well, he doesn't really leave it out. It's in the realm of perception. But then, of course, we have a new set of problems. James, in fact, says very little about the perception that causes emotion. In fact, sometimes, very much in tune with the psychology of his time, he suggests that these are basically instinctual in nature. And at least some emotions are caused by instinctual reactions which involve really very little thought and, in fact, very little of what we would normally call perception at all. For instance, there is a kind of natural fear of snakes. There is a natural revulsion of vast quantities of blood. Whether or not these instinctual theses are true, nevertheless, it's pretty clear that in James, in the account of emotions, perception gets very short shrift. One could say that perceptions are always about something. Perceptions are intentional in precisely Sartre's sense. And in that sense, one can say James captures the notion of intentionality in the perception part of the thesis. But then we have some other problems, because it's not the emotion itself that is about something, but it's rather the perception. And to say that a cause 2 steps removed from the emotion is intentional is not necessarily to say that the emotion itself is intentional. But it gets worse than that. For example, a bear steps out from behind a tree as I'm taking a walk through the woods. This is one of William James's own examples. I have this familiar sensation of queasiness in my stomach, and my knees feel weak, and I feel rather flushed and tense. And of course, what I feel is fear. What is the fear? It is that set of sensations which is caused by the physiological upset, which is caused in turn by my sudden perception of the bear. Well, not so fast. Let's ask a question. How do we know that the emotion is fear? Just suppose I have just broken off a relationship with a particularly hairy lover, and as the bear jumps out from behind